His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We run a little long today because we've got a lot to cover, a lot of momentous events, an era in history when big things were happening, big personalities. We're talking captains of industry, intrigue, booms and busts, assassination attempts, mass movements of men and ammunition, Teddy Roosevelt, and of course the war to end all wars, all unpacked for us by today's very special guest.
I'm Richard Welch. I live in Northport. I've been a history teacher on both the secondary and collegiate level. I have a doctorate in American history from Stony Brook, and I am the author of 7 books and a lot of articles, reviews, and currently I am a trustee at the Suffolk County Historical Society.
Great, and I want to throw in, because I want to ask you this later, former editor of the Long Island Forum, right?
Yes, I was, from about 1991 until it went under in, 2004?
Great, and we're here to talk about one of those books at least. Do you want to give us the exact title?
The exact title is...
Is it Gold Coast Warriors, or is it?
All right. The reason why I had a pause there is that when I do a talk or a presentation about it, I simply call it Gold Coast Warriors. However, the history press likes things to be totally clear to people who don't necessarily know much about the topic. So the title of the book is Long Island's Gold Coast Elite and the Great War.
Okay. So that gives us a time and the place. So for the listeners that maybe don't have the geography down, can you just give us where are you defining the Gold Coast as, from west to east, say?
Well, you're correct that, different people might have slightly different parameters for it, but I generally think that it begins at the Queens Line around Great Neck, Kings Point, and it probably begins to peter out somewhere about where I am now, around Lloyd Neck, going over to Asherock and that kind of thing. And it extends down roughly to the LIE Northern State, or if you like to use natural features, it goes down to the Ronkonkoma Moraine. There are other places on the island which even then, had their own, let's say, smaller scale version of the Gold Coast. But I think that's where you had and maybe still do the most concentrated number of estates, money, and social and political juice.
Okay, and we'll get up to America's entry into the war in 1917. But in terms of the development of that area, I'm more familiar with the growth of the South Shore and William K. Vanderbilt and actually the Robert Roosevelt. We'll talk about the Roosevelt family. So can you give us your broad brush? What drew these people, this wealth, to that area, to the North Shore? And when did it start getting that reputation?
It really begins, you can always trace things back earlier, but it really kicks in around the 1890s. And among the reasons were improvements in transportation. And also at the time, these places were not necessarily that expensive. They were primarily farms, woodlots, pastures, that particular type of thing. But a lot of it was relatively undeveloped. So if you bought a chunk of it, then you could begin to put your estate together. And what happened was a lot of people who were making fantastic amounts of money in various types of industries, but also in banking, insurance, things which supported it. They had offices in New York, headquarters in New York, but they wanted to have what were considered vacation summer residences, and some became almost permanent. They would go to the office and then they'd come back. And so once you got a number of people showing up there, then more would want to be involved in it. And they were linked partly by their wealth, partly by the fact that they were all doing business at the same time. They also was very similar in outlook. Ethnically, they were all, with very few exceptions, of what you might call Anglo-Saxon or WASP heritage. They were, again, with a very few exceptions, almost all Protestants. Most of them either had gone to an Ivy League school or they were in the process of arranging so that their children and families could do it. And they also very quickly began to establish different types of country clubs, social clubs with membership requirements, which weren't just, in terms of money. So they also networked in that particular fashion. And sometimes you even see clusters of them working for the same company. And so basically, by the time you're at 1900, 1910, you probably had in this area the most concentrated amount of wealth in the United States, and they advertised it by the estates which they built, some of which are still extant. The houses are anyway. Very few of the estates, even the ones that survived, have the same amount of land which they had. But certainly you can, go to a place like, Old Westbury Gardens or Coe Hall, Quandre Hall, and you can see, what it was.
And in terms of the families or the names, which we'll get to generalize, would you say they were of Long Island, or were they all transplants coming in from other? They
were almost all transplants. And this was a phenomenon that would continue even after the First World War, when Vincent Astor and Marshall Field, set up their estates there. But the Morgans were in the city, but originally I believe they were from Connecticut. Davison was upstate, and then Connecticut came over. And you find people like that. They're really sort of alighting, and they attract more and more people who want to be, where the action is and where also you can display yourself to a certain degree with the accoutrements of your lifestyle.
So we'll get to, the main premise of your book was these people and their influence on our entry into World War I or World War I in general. But leading up to that, say in the early days of the 20th century, were they that involved in politics or in shaping sort of events? I guess we want to start with J.P. Morgan and his family.
Well, they certainly didn't jump into foreign policy and political matters before the war as they did during it. But certainly the main bankers, and the Morgan family is, the big elephant, as far as that's concerned. Morgan was able basically to bail out the United States during, a threatened recession, lent the government money. Anytime he moved in a particular direction was important, but mostly what he was interested in was domestic, economics. They were almost all Republicans at this point in time, but again, there are always the exceptions. But they don't, send any family members off trying to, to get elected to office. Roosevelt is unusual for that. But certainly Roosevelt came from comfortable background, and he made more money as time went on, but he was not at the level of, any of the Whitneys, Vanderbilts, Phipps, or any of those people. Well, by the way, he disdained them. He considered them all plutocrats.
Oh, it's interesting because he plays, it's almost like you have different strands of millionaires or this society, because he's of the North Shore, Theodore Roosevelt, and I guess he's moving in these circles, but like you're saying, he wasn't necessarily part of their clique.
No, he really wasn't. To some degree, he probably becomes at least a little bit more involved with them once the war begins, because they're sort of political allies in terms of the foreign policy. But he came from old money, and the Roosevelts was certainly an established, prosperous family, but, they didn't have that, outsized wealth that came when the Industrial Revolution really kicked in, and, which would be exhibited by, the coal, steel, copper barons, bankers, and that kind of thing.
So how would you say, what was the involvement of these people with the affairs of Europe? Because that kind of what draws them into it, right? They have vested interests in a lot of the countries that go to war in 1914. So stick with Morgan. How deeply was he involved with what would become the Allied powers, France and Britain?
Well, the Morgan Bank had branches, and they did have a major one in London. They also had another one in Paris. I'm not sure they had any in Germany. It wouldn't surprise me if they did, since Germany was a major industrial power. But again, partly because I think of their ethno-religious background, they tend to gravitate toward Britain especially, and they travel there quite often. J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, I mean, he spent a great deal of time in Britain. And in fact, as an adult, he may have been there almost as much as he was in New York. So they're very familiar with it. I guess you might say their natural inclination is to support the Allies. Almost none of them are German. The Warburgs, who are not a big factor in New York, but they are in banking, they were of German descent, but they're sort of an anomaly.
And you write about the lifestyle in the North Shore. It was definitely an Anglo-Saxon world that they inherited, fox hunting and the manners they built, and just down to the architecture. So it was really, I guess you would say, part of their culture, right? Or their identity they had adopted.
Yeah, they saw that, as their, I guess, their Anglo-American heritage as far as that's concerned. And this would have been, to a large degree, reinforced by the prep schools and the Ivy League schools at the time.
And so we're saying Morgan, so at the time frame we're talking, it's really Jack that's running the company. Is JP dead by then, the father?
Yeah, JP, I believe it's 1913 he dies, and Jack, or JP Jr., takes over. And again, he spends a lot of time in Britain, and he's interested in working on his father's art collection and book collection, what becomes the Morgan Library. And so essentially, he leaves the actual operations to Harry Davison, who was a rising star in the Morgan Bank. And he sort of functions almost as a chief executive officer. And more than anybody, he's really running Morgan operations, from, 1913 until 1970. 1917, he sort of has a change of trajectory.
And just to place them on the island, I think Jack was in Glen Cove. Were they both in Glen Cove? Where were their?
No, Jack's in Glen Cove. He's up on what, the locals still call Morgan Island, although sometimes it's called East Island. And right across from that little, inlet there from Morgan Island to the mainland, quote unquote, of Glen Cove, there was another Morgan partner by the name of Porter there. Davison is a little bit east. As the crow flies, it probably isn't much more than a mile. And he bought a place called Peacock Point, which is in Laddingtown. And in fact, it's just over the line from Glen Cove.
And so in terms of the European situation, the war breaks out in 1914. And how does that affect the Morgan Company's business, or what opportunities do they see as the war heats up?
Well, I think all the banks were initially, like in the first couple of days, wondering, how this thing is going to affect them. But I think mostly, very quickly, they began to realize that they could not only adjust to it, but they could profit from it. And in the case of the Morgan Bank, and also, they have some of the smaller New York banks, they sort of pull in their train. Their instincts were all pro-Allied. And they begin to realize very quickly that the Allies, and again, leading with Britain, are going to need enormous amounts of money if they're going to fight this, because it becomes clear really after the first months of fighting that this thing isn't going to end very soon, that, the idea of one quick victory and it's, mostly over is not going to happen. And so what Davison does, and he's supported by Jack, and he's also supported by the other partners, particularly Tommy Lamont is sort of like his right-hand man. And he goes to Britain, sizes up the situation, begins to figure out what they're going to need. And by the beginning of 1915, he's organizing substantial loans for Britain. Some of these are also partly redistributed to France, occasionally even to Russia and Portugal. But Britain is the epicenter. And also by 1915, because these countries are chewing up not only their youth on the battlefields, but they're also chewing up enormous amounts of equipment and supplies, that he begins to realize that the Morgan Bank can play a further role by organizing supplies for Britain and the other allies. And he creates a subsidiary export department for the Morgan Bank. And he taps a guy by the name of Edward Stettinius to run the thing. He was a little bit of an outlier. He's originally from the Midwest, from the St. Louis area, although by this point he's established in New York, and ultimately he's going to have a house in Lettingtown. And so what Stettinius will do is he will begin to contact various American manufacturers. Some of them would be like the DuPonts, they manufacture ammunition. Also, he's going to let out all kinds of contracts for steel, copper. Food is a major ingredient as well. And by the end of 1915, the United States is sending enormous amounts of supplies to the British. And not inconsequently, they're going to take the country, because of this war-based economy, they're going to take it from what had been a recession in 1912-13, and by 1950, it is boom times. And of course, this then becomes, a consideration politically as well as economically. The United States is supposed to be neutral. We claim freedom of the sea, so we can trade with anybody, but because the British Navy controlled all the sea routes, all the trade, well, I shouldn't say all, but the overwhelming amount of trade was with Britain and the other allies. Trade with Germany slowed to a trickle. And of course, the Germans don't find it amusing that we are supplying not only the money, but the sinews of war, if I do want to be a little poetic about it, to their enemies.
And in terms of, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, is president and was reelected before, as keeping America out of war was part of his platform. So how much of what Davison was doing with the Morgan Company was, if not illegal, against the wishes of the government? Or was there anyone saying, what the heck are you doing? Or was it kind of accepted? Or
there are some people who are opposed to this. For example, there are peace groups and non-interventionist groups who are active in the United States. And they sort of get overwhelmed by the drumbeat to intervene in the war. Is it illegal? It is, generally speaking, it's not technically illegal. All right. That is, you can, according to international law, sell to warring parties. On the other hand, you're supposed to be able to sell to them equally. And there was never a point where the United States said, okay, you can have the supplies if you come over and get them. In other words, we were sending our ships and also Americans on British ships into what were war zones, which is eventually going to get involved with German U-boats who will at various times sink them. And that will be ultimately the reason why we will say that we're getting into the war. Some of the shipments are questionable. So, for example, the famous Lusitania incident in 1915, it was a passenger liner. It was going into what the Germans had declared was a war zone. You have to remember the British put a blockade on Germany, and so the Germans at times would try to put a blockade with the submarines around Britain. And they even put ads in the papers, if Americans are going to Britain, maybe you better not go on a British liner through a war zone. But some Americans did, and the Lusitania was torpedoed and went down very, very quickly, which caused a great deal of outrage because it was civilians, it was a passenger liner. But the truth was that the hold was full of ammunition, which is why when the torpedo struck, it set off all these secondary and tertiary explosions, which is why it went down so fast. Now, should you put ammunition on a passenger liner? But to get back to your larger question, the Wilson administration is, what shall we say, conflicted would be a generous term for it about it. On the one hand, they know that this isn't actually, playing a straight shooter kind of role. And at the beginning of the war, Wilson called on Americans to be neutral in, action as well as thought, that kind of stuff. But it's not happening that way. Originally, when Davison is arranging loans, the Wilson administration got, nervous because, should we be arranging loans for combatants or belligerents? But What Davison did, he simply regrouped them or rebranded them as war credits. What's the difference between a war credit and a loan? Absolutely nothing. And by 1916, they dropped that pretense entirely. Wilson is uneasy about some of this stuff, but he doesn't seem quite to know what to do about it. Most of his administration is pro-war. His first Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was very much against intervention, but he was replaced in 1915 by Robert Lansing, who was basically a war hawk. There's an interesting book, by the way, called The Road Not Taken, which is really about a peace initiative, which really began with the Germans, picked up by the French and by the British in 1916, because a lot of the leading figures in government were becoming appalled by the casualties and the cost of the war. But they were all sort of waiting for Wilson to announce he's calling for a peace conference, sort of the way Teddy Roosevelt had called the Portsmouth Conference. But Wilson never quite picks up on it. And the argument in the book, and it's pretty convincing because it's got a good deal of documentation, is there was a real chance to end the war at the end of 16, beginning of 17, but it didn't happen. And Wilson is the guy who dropped or fumbled the ball.
And just to go back to the Lusitania for a second, is it possible to say the munitions that were hidden on that ship were things that the Morgan Company would have brokered? Or
Oh, yeah, they were the big brokers. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to get the year right. It's 1916. It was a huge explosion at a warehouse wharf complex, a place called Black Tom, which is basically right across from the Statue of Liberty. It was a peninsula, and it was a massive explosion because there were all these munitions which were being, ready to go on ships. So, I mean, you're talking about major supplies. By 1916, the British realized they could not continue the war without American money and American material support. And of course, what they really wanted was for us to get involved full-time, send troops as well as supplies.
I could see when we were talking about, the extent to which the Morgan Company was financing the war, in a sense. I wanted to ask you about the assassination attempt in Glen Cove. Do you want to just give us the outlines of that event?
Yeah, there was this an assassination attempt on JP Jr. or Jack, and it was carried out by a guy who called himself Holt, but his real name was Munter, and he seems to have been in Germany, but he'd been in the United States for a long time, and he's probably a guy who's a little bit shaky psychologically. In fact, he had murdered his wife right as the war was beginning, and he fled to Mexico for a while, but he gravitates back up. And of all things, he's teaching up in Ithaca. Nobody who knew him at the time thought, they thought that he was anti-intervention, and he thought that Germany was not getting a fair shake from the U.S. government, and that Morgan and his allies, were effectively carrying out their own sort of warfare. So he comes down state and he does two things. Well, he does more than two things, and using different pseudonyms. For one thing, he put a bomb in the cloakroom of the U.S. Senate, which, by the way, did go off, but nobody was there. And no one was hurt in that. He had also been effectively hiding out in what is today Old Bethpage. It was called Central Park then. And he had been accumulating some firearms and also dynamite and explosives. And what he did, he went up to the Morgan estate in Glen Cove. And at the time, there were no real guards. Later on, after this happened, there's a little bridge that goes over from the Glen Cove mainland onto Morgan Island. But there was nobody there. So he goes up there, and his story changes a little bit. But basically, he goes up to the door, knocks on the door, says he wants to meet Mr. Morgan. I mean, and some of the maids and the butlers are not sure, but he bursts through, and he's running through the house. And he had some explosives on him, but he doesn't detonate them. And finally goes up to the second floor, and he confronts Morgan, and he pulls out a gun and he jumps on him. But Morgan was a pretty hefty guy, who gets the better of him. He got shot, I think, twice, but they turned out to be very minor, and they subdue Holt. They called, the constabulary, and he gets sent to the lockup in Mineola. And basically saying, that, he didn't really want to hurt Morgan, that what he wanted to do was to more or less hold him for ransom, and that he'd let him go after the Morgan Company said it, would cease, its supply and loan activities. How, he thought any of this was going to happen, of course, is hard to say. But at any rate, he was being held there. And what happened was he died in Epsteinian-like circumstances. Supposedly, he got up on a pail and he hanged himself. But, no one was around. No one's looking at this guy. This is perhaps the most high-profile attempted assassination since somebody tried to kill Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. But at any rate, he was dead. The thing was investigated. No one ever came up with any kind of a conspiracy. And there certainly were German secret agents who were around, and they were the ones who set off the explosion at Black Tom. They occasionally were able to get bombs onto some of the ships sailing to Europe with supplies, and none of them caused enough damage that it really affected the flow. I thought that the best evidence is Munter was a little bit disturbed.
Where do you see it change from? So I can see the Morgan and the moneyed interests profiting and seeing the money to be made in the war, but they also shift, and even in their families and with their sons, a drumbeat to get American and American youth into the war and sort of the glories of being, I guess, bloodied or proving yourself. So how do you see that shift happening from just the monetary, profiting off of it to like, hey, we want America to go in there and send our sons over there and start fighting?
Oh, I think many of the leading families would have been ready for it almost immediately. Teddy Roosevelt becomes very anti-German and very pro-intervention very quickly. He's occasionally critical of what the British do, but that's a minor thing. It's sort of more nuanced. And he was a major supporter of the preparedness movement, which called upon the United States to enlarge its military, which was quite small at the time, certainly for a country the size of the United States. We had an army of approximately, you see different numbers, let's say 150, 160,000 men. You could augment them with National Guard troops who were indifferently trained. And of course, they could see that, the armies in Europe, there are millions of men. This is war on a scale that hadn't been seen before. So they call upon not only the military to expand, but Roosevelt in particular works it out with the major figure in the Army Command, General Leonard Wood, to set up these preparedness camps and army camps. The first big one was up at Plattsburgh. And what would happen would be during the summer, it was originally young businessmen, but then it caught on with a lot of college men. They would go up in the summer. They would have to pay, for their uniform and stuff like that. But the Army would give them some rudiments of drill, marksmanship, some familiarity with weapons and tactics, that kind of thing. And so the idea was that this would be like a reserve force which could expand. And also, since you were going to have some officers who were better trained when the real army got built up, and I think it was assumed from the beginning there'd be a draft, that these guys could be the officers who would then command it. So beginning in 1915, you've got these preparedness camps, and the Roosevelt kids are all going there. Harry Davison's sons, who are on the crew team up at Yale, they get very interested in naval aviation, which was embryonic at the point. And they convince their father, Harry, to buy them some seaplanes. And they recruit among other members of the crew team. They go down to Long Island. They learn how to fly in Port Washington. And later on, when the United States does go into the war, they then, apply to get a commission in the Navy as pilots, and they do their test flights in Huntington Bay. They all make it except for the one son who spark plug, his name was Truby Davison. Something happened Some people think maybe he was so nervous and so pent up about this thing finally getting his pilot's wings and all this stuff. But anyway, he crashes his plane. All the others went over and saw action, but he didn't because he was too badly hurt. So that's some of them, and also some members of the Phipps family. They're going to get involved in it. Almost all the families who have younger children are going to be involved.
And you mentioned some of the wives get involved, I think, in nursing and setting up that type of assistance.
Yeah, the first Roosevelt's over there. Teddy always attracts the eye because he's the ex-president, and also he's up front and in your face about what we should do and what Wilson's doing wrong. But at any rate, the very first months of the war, his daughter Ethel and her husband Richard Derby, they go over to France. He was a doctor, she was a nurse, and the French had set up this thing called the American Hospital. And the American Hospital would treat French and other Allied soldiers who were wounded. At the same time, there was this thing called the American Ambulance Service, and this was staffed by volunteers, including many college boys. Truby Davison and his brother Harry Jr., were involved in this, and the United States was neutral, so they couldn't wear American uniforms, but they did have these things which looked like a uniform. They didn't fight in the sense that they're shooting, weapons, but they are taking, again, Allied soldiers from the front lines back to a hospital behind the lines. And, that's going on, in 1915 and 16. And of course, there's the very famous Lafayette Escadrille of American pilots who joined the French Air Force. None of the Gold Coast families, I think, have a member in that, but they're involved in virtually everything else. And, they're running all these huge loan drives and also these big demonstrations, effectively demanding American intervention in the war. Some of them are local, but there are some massive ones in New York.
And so in terms of the amount of, say, popular pull they had, I mean, were they effective in changing, or if they even had to change, but in the popular imagination or the popular press, were they effective, and were they seen as leading the charge to get into war? And did people listen to them? Were they kind of public figures in that way?
Well, they do, have an effect. Roosevelt was still very popular, and in fact, he probably would have been president in 1912 if he hadn't split the Republican vote, going third party. And also Roosevelt, living up in what is now Oyster Bay Cove, he has a neighbor who's in motion pictures. They put out propaganda movies even before we're involved in the war. What would happen if the United States was attacked, and what happened would be that we'd be taken over because we were unprepared, we weren't militarized, and this foreign country could do it. Foreign country unnamed, but everybody know who they meant. And also a recent Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, not very well known today unless you go to a middle school in South Huntington, but he was pretty well known then, and he's doing the same thing that Roosevelt is doing, but somewhat more temperate. He's not quite as nasty toward Wilson, that kind of thing. So yes, they do have an effect.
But when we do enter the war, does... so the this millionaire class, if you want to say they won or they got their wish, how quickly does Wilson assume then, sort of take away their thunder in a way, like in terms of assuming the issue that they were fighting for? I'm thinking of the scene where Roosevelt wanted Wilson to allow him to raise his own brigade or whatever it was, and Wilson kind of cuts him down.
Well, we'll deal with Roosevelt first. Roosevelt was thinking that he would raise an organization of volunteers like the Rough Riders, which were organized outside of normal, Army channels. They were the first U.S. volunteers. But he was thinking on a grander scale. He could raise a division. And he had probably bounced this idea off with General Leonard Wood. And he had even gone so far as, when it looked like the United States was really going to get involved in the war, and Wilson asked for a declaration of war, which is April 1917, that he had begun to fill out the roster of officers. And then he sent a missive to Washington, I guess to Wilson personally, and probably to the War Department, the Army, staff, and that kind of thing, in which he proposes this. And, he says, I'm not in, such great shape anymore, but, I'd like to take my part, maybe I could be, some kind of an, officer behind the lines, that kind of stuff. Now, a couple of things happened. For one thing, the Army didn't want this at all. They didn't want any, of these sort of wildcat organizations. They wanted things under their own control, so they were opposed to it. And Wilson had really taken a lot of personal abuse from Roosevelt, during the time when at least we weren't a belligerent in the war. And he tells Roosevelt that, the time for these kinds of organizations, is over. War is now scientific, and sorry, but forget it. But what do they do? Well, first of all, what happens is the financing is entirely taken over by the U.S. government, which, by the way, ultimately is going to have to assume the paying of the loans, which the Morgans have been selling. But that's a story in itself. A number of them take government positions. Harry Davison, he becomes one of the so-called dollar a day or $1 a year men. In other words, the government did need people who knew how to run things very well, and particularly to coordinate types of operations. So Davison was given an honorary rank, but he was made head of the Red Cross War Council. Now, the Red Cross was a big deal at the time, obviously on the battlefields and behind them, but also, to support the war effort back in the U.S. And they needed lots of money. And overseas, the Red Cross even at times, acted as kind of a subsidiary paymaster for wounded French troops. And the idea was you're going to need a bundle of money in order to do this. And Davison launches this thing called the Kick the Kaiser campaign. The goal was to make, maybe get, somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. And most people thought you'd be lucky if you got 80. I think he got somewhere like 110 or 120 million. And he did this primarily by means of these large rallies and getting people to make loans, donations, that kind of thing. So he gets involved in that. And interestingly, he becomes more of an internationalist. He begins to think about the possibilities of an international Red Cross. He begins to think a little bit more seriously about, what the peace will be like and what rebuilding will be like. And he really does have what one historian called an epiphany. He was probably pretty much, a hard-nosed banker with a very driven personality. He's got things he wants to do, but he became almost a little bit like a philanthropist.
And so a lot of the generations go through the war. We can say Roosevelt loses a son, I think, right? Quentin dies over Europe.
Yes.
What effect did it have on the North Shore community, the Gold Coast community, after the war? Did it change how they approached things, or were they still looking to profit and maybe ultra patriotic? Or what do you see as sort of the residual effects or the after effects of this?
Yeah, they're going to vary to some degree. Almost all of them go back into their pre-war positions. A number of them now have deepened their international connections, and their international connections are primarily with Britain and France. Although, because of the reparations payment schedule on Germany, which was part of the Versailles Treaty, that Morgan bankers actually get involved in that to some degree. Matter of fact, to a large degree, as far as, in order to try to make the thing work. So the Morgan Bank certainly is still involved. Many American firms are, if anything, they're strengthened internationally. And they've also been aided by the fact that the United States is the only country that comes out of the war in better shape than it went in. Britain and France, they're on the winning side, but Britain had to sell off an enormous amount of its assets and most of its international holdings. And most of those are taken over by American interests. And again, Morgan would be one of the leaders in that type of thing. And for that matter, although it's not necessarily clear right away that it's happening, but it is happening, New York is replacing London as the center of international finance. So, they're all in many ways enhanced. The older generation, they're looking sort of at, retirement, but the younger ones are still very involved in this. A few of them try politics. Ted Roosevelt Jr. tried it. He wasn't very good at it. He was better in administrative roles. Truby Davison, he was involved in certain government work. He was an assemblyman from New York. I think he was a congressman briefly. He got involved in the aeronautics administration. So you find some of them doing things like that. One of the younger ones that, I mentioned, he's got a very colorful character, Tommy Hitchcock Jr. He was 17. He wanted to join the Army Air Service, the forerunner of the what is today the Air Force. He was too young. They wouldn't take him in. He finagled his way into the French Air Force. He got into a dogfight, shot down a number of German planes. One of them shot him down. He was wounded, captured, gets home, and he gets involved in a number of things. He does get involved in banking. They almost all sort of had at least one finger in banking, and but also he was involved in air freight, and he also became a star polo player at a time when it was a major sport. I mean, you can go down the list of them, but most of the younger ones, at least, are going to have what I call second acts when the Second World War comes along.
Well, in terms of the North Shore, the Gold Coast itself, after the war, we get into the Gatsby era, which some people may know it from more. Is it ever quite the same, or what's the final fate, would you say, or what changes the nature of the Gold Coast from this heyday?
During the 20s, if anything, it becomes more opulent. And the younger generation is having a great time. And I'm obviously not talking about, the people who are doing the gardening and maid service and that kind of stuff. But although some of them are pretty well paid for what they're doing. But things look good. The 20s are prosperous, with the exception of the agricultural sector, which goes into a recession relatively quickly as the demand for American food overseas drops off. The United States, supposedly is isolationist, which I always thought was, and still think, is a gross exaggeration. We're involved all over the world, but we didn't join the League of Nations, although we did have representatives there. So it's not like we dropped out, and we were involved in various kinds of international treaties. So things are good until, of course, the crash. And, the taxation is somewhat different. Income tax comes in 1913, but it was relatively low, really in this particular time period. It wasn't a major hit, and I don't think there was any state income tax. But when the crash comes, all the banks contract. The income that the families have begins to contract, in general. And that's when things really begin to change. And also, there's going to be another generation coming up. And I think a lot of the ones coming up during the Second World War, not their parents who grew up during the First, but the very younger ones, they're not really interested in running estates that much. A few are, and they're trying to keep it intact, or at least keep the mansion house. But they have different lifestyles and expectations. And so that's when the lifestyle really begins to change.
Before I let you go, if you want to pivot for a second, because I had mentioned the Long Island Forum, which I was not a subscriber, apologies, but I missed that opportunity, the window. But I have it on CD, so it fascinates me. So can you tell us a little bit, how would you describe what the Long Island Forum was? What role did it serve? What did you see as its strength in its day?
Well, the Long Island Forum was actually, for a long time, the oldest and longest running periodical, continuously running periodical of Long Island history. There were some other ones around, but they didn't last long. It was primarily, amateur writers, begun in 1939 by Paul Bailey, carried on by, I guess, his son-in-law, Carl Starace, who I knew. And they depended upon, what you might call amateur historians, not necessarily that they weren't good, but they weren't academically trained, that kind of thing. And, the quality of the articles, varied. Some of them were very good, and some of them were kind of fluffy or not very serious. I came on in 91 when the Friends for Long Island's Heritage had bought it. And Carl was getting older, and he was having a harder time with it. And also, he had sort of what you might call a stable of writers, but they were his age, and in other words, they're aging out. Some of them have moved away. Not a few of them were deceased. And so the idea was to try to perhaps crank it up a little bit. And I saw my job as, in general, trying to improve the overall level of scholarship and writing. And I think in general I did that, and also to recruit, new writers and hopefully some younger ones. By this point in time, there was a periodical originating out in Stony Brook. I was on their editorial board, called the Long Island Historical Journal. It's still published online, no longer in print. And they were more academic. For one thing, they had access, they were the logical target for all the students, that kind of stuff generated there. So my idea was that the forum would sort of be like American Heritage to the historical journals, Journal of American History. In other words, something that would be more accessible and interesting, to, interested, but not professional, historically oriented people on the island. And that's where I went.
I don't know how you feel. This is my big picture question in terms of Long Island history. Where do you see it at today? You mentioned, and I should mention, I work at Stony Brook, so I've seen that journal. But where do you see it? You've been following it and part of it for decades now. How would you assess the state of Long Island history, and where would you like to see it go?
Wow. Well, I guess there's the question of, general knowledge and professional knowledge. If you're talking about academic departments, I would say that not all, but most of the departments look at Long Island history as sort of just a component part of overall themes. There is certainly in the last few years more of an interest in and concentration on minority groups. Some of this is because a lot of times they were either overlooked or, let's say, underrepresented, all right, in the past. But I think that might be exaggerated to some degree. If you look around, there was always some stuff being done. But nevertheless, it's not a bad approach. And you'll see that kind of thing coming along. In terms of general knowledge, I think, in local historical societies and historical events, it's still reasonably healthy. All right. In other words, they still get volunteers. Some of them still have their own newsletters and that kind of thing. But I would guess that as time goes on, since history seems to be de-emphasized in large parts of the educational system, I'm not sure if there'll be a diminution of that awareness of local history among the general public as it's looking at other things. I hope not, but that could very well be the case.
And thank you again to Richard for speaking with us. That was recorded over Zoom. We will have links in our show notes to where you can find him, where you can find his book, as well as some links to related resources. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. And if you have your own story to tell, if you have done your own deep dive into a corner of Long Island history, whether you are a historian, someone with a family story, or just came across something you couldn't let go, drop us a line. We'd love to talk to you. We are at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. That does it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.